The cold, sterile silence of the galactic auction hall was broken only by the distant hum of technology. The high ceilings and flashing lights reflected the dark underbelly of the universe, where beings of every race, from every corner of the galaxy, were sold for profit. Here, in the depths of space, the law of the strong ruled, and the weak were nothing more than property. It was a place where lives were bought and sold like cattle. Michael stood in chains, his muscular frame tense as he looked around at the other slaves lined up beside him. He had once been a soldier, a protector of his people. But now he was nothing, a prisoner. His arms were shackled, his clothes torn from years of conflict, and his face bore the scars of battles fought far from home. The aliens surrounding him had no understanding of what it meant to be human, what it meant to fight for survival, to fight for something greater than oneself. They only saw him as a commodity, a body to be owned and used. The bidding began, and Michael stood tall despite the humiliation. Each alien species that called out their bid was more grotesque than the last. There were cold-blooded reptilian creatures with eyes that gleamed with hunger, insect-like beings who spoke in chittering tones, and the towering, hulking forms of warlords who seemed to relish the idea of breaking him. Michael's heart raced, but his face remained calm, betraying nothing. He refused to show weakness. No matter what happened, he would not bow to them. Then, the room fell silent as the entrance doors opened with a sharp hiss. The others turned to see the figure who entered, the alien queen. Queen Seraphia. Her presence commanded the room, and all eyes were immediately drawn to her. She was tall, regal, and beautiful, with an air of authority that couldn't be ignored. Her long, silver hair flowed down her back like a waterfall of moonlight, and her dark violet skin shimmered in the bright lights of the auction hall. Her eyes, glowing faintly with a cold fire, scanned the room, and Michael couldn't help but notice the power in her gaze. She was the ruler of this planet, a conqueror who had crushed entire civilizations under her iron fist. As she walked down the aisle, her high-heeled boots clicking on the metal floor, the auctioneer bowed low to her. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice trembling. "We have many fine specimens tonight, but I believe you will find this one particularly." "I know what I want," she interrupted, her voice smooth and commanding, cutting through the auctioneer's words like a blade. Without looking at the slaves, she turned her gaze directly on Michael. The room grew still. The entire auction hall was frozen in time as the queen's eyes locked onto his. Michael could feel the weight of her gaze, as though she was sizing him up, measuring his worth with nothing more than a look. It was the same look he had seen countless times before from his enemies, the look of a predator sizing up its prey. For a moment, Michael thought he saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Was it curiosity? Maybe it was admiration. Whatever it was, it unsettled him. He had always been taught to stand firm, to never show fear. But there was something about Seraphia that made him question even his own instincts. The auctioneer cleared his throat. "The human, sir, the human soldier." He gestured to Michael, but the queen didn't seem to need the introduction. She was already making her decision. Seraphia stepped forward, raising a delicate hand to signal the auctioneer to stop. "I'll take him," she declared coldly. "How much?" The bidding was instantly forgotten. The room went silent again as Seraphia raised her hand to place a bid that immediately shut out any other offers. It was more than the others could offer, more than any of them had ever seen. She didn't care about money or resources. She cared about power, and Michael was hers to control. "Sold," the auctioneer declared, and a strange chill ran through the room. Michael's heart pounded in his chest. He had been sold to the most powerful creature in the galaxy, but he would not be broken. He couldn't be. As Seraphia's personal guards moved toward him, ready to chain him further, Michael held his head high. His defiance was clear in the way he carried himself, in the way he met the queen's gaze one last time. She smiled at him, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was the smile of someone who knew she had won, who knew she had all the power. "You will serve me well, human," she said softly, almost as if speaking to herself. But you will learn quickly. Resistance is futile. As the guards approached him to shackling him for the final time, Michael made no move to resist. He would wait for the right moment. No matter what she thought, no matter how powerful she seemed, he was still a soldier who had fought and survived battles far greater than this, and he would fight again. They led him away, out of the auction hall and into the depths of Seraphia's palace, but Michael's mind never wavered. The queen had bought him, but she had no idea what she was truly bringing into her world. She was powerful, yes, but humans had something that no alien race could ever truly understand. They had heart. And that was something Seraphia was about to learn the hard way. Michael's first days under Queen Seraphia's rule were nothing like he had imagined. The palace was a vast, cold structure that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. Metal walls, high-tech corridors, and robotic servants filled the enormous rooms. Everywhere he looked, he saw displays of alien technology, from AI-driven security systems to cloaked drones silently observing every move. The queen had spared no expense in creating her fortress, a place where she could keep everything and everyone under her control. But despite the grandeur of the palace, Michael felt nothing but a burning desire for freedom. The chains around his wrists and ankles were a constant reminder of his captivity, and no matter how many times Seraphia's guards tugged at them to show him his place, he refused to show fear. The queen had ordered that he serve her, but it was more than just bringing her food or attending to her needs. She wanted to break him, to show him who was truly in control. Every task was designed to test his obedience, but Michael's spirit remained unbroken. He was forced to wear the same drab clothes every day, torn from the battles he had fought before his capture. The humans were treated like tools, expendable and unimportant. But Michael wasn't just any human. He had fought in wars, survived battles, and seen things that most of these alien creatures could never understand. He was a soldier, and he knew how to adapt. On his second day, Seraphia summoned him to her personal chambers. The room was vast, decorated with strange alien artifacts and shimmering light sources that seemed to float in the air. The queen sat on a throne, her posture straight, regal, yet there was something about her that felt different now, less cold, perhaps. She wasn't the ruthless conqueror from the auction anymore. There was a strange curiosity in her eyes as she studied him, as if she were trying to read him, to figure out why he wasn't afraid. "Human," she said, her voice smooth and calm. "I want you to understand that you are nothing here. You are mine now. I own you." Michael stood before her, the chains rattling with each breath he took. He met her gaze, refusing to bow or cower. "I'm not your pet, Your Majesty," he said in a low voice. "You can chain my body, but you will never chain my mind." The queen's lips curled into a small smile. There was no anger in her expression, only amusement. She had expected him to break quickly. But this human, this soldier, was different. He wasn't like the others she had owned. He didn't flinch, didn't beg. "I see," she said, her tone softening slightly. "You have spirit, but I promise you, it won't last." Seraphia stood from her throne and walked toward him, her steps echoing in the vast room. She circled him like a predator observing its prey, her eyes scanning him from head to toe. "You're strong. I'll give you that. But you're also foolish," she said. "You think you can resist me, but you cannot. I have everything at my disposal, and you are just one human. A soldier, yes, but still just a man. You will bend to my will, sooner or later." Michael said nothing in response, but inside, he was forming a plan. He had been a soldier for too long to be fooled by empty threats. He knew how to wait for the right moment, to observe and find weaknesses. And as he studied Seraphia, he saw something that might be her weakness. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The queen wasn't as invincible as she appeared. The days stretched on. Each task Michael was given was harder than the last, designed to push him further, to break his spirit. But with each passing day, Michael found himself more determined. He worked with precision, completing every task with the same quiet efficiency he had learned in his years of service. It was as though nothing could break him. He cleaned the Queen's chambers, prepared her meals, and followed her commands with unwavering discipline. But there were moments when their eyes would meet, and the tension between them was undeniable. Seraphia would often catch him studying her, and for a brief second, there would be a flicker of something in her eyes, something close to admiration, or maybe curiosity. "You think I don't notice you?" she asked him one evening as they shared a quiet moment in her chamber. "I see everything, human. I see the way you watch me, as if you're trying to figure me out." Michael didn't respond, but there was something in his silence that seemed to intrigue her further. It was as if he didn't care about her status, her power, or her beauty. He only saw her as another person, another being who could be defeated. "You're very different from the others," she remarked, her tone thoughtful. "Most of my subjects are broken by now. But you stand strong. Why?" Michael turned to her, his eyes steady. "Because I have nothing to lose. You may have bought my body, but my mind and my soul are mine, and no one can take that from me." Seraphia looked at him for a long moment, the silence between them growing heavier with each passing second. She didn't respond immediately, but there was a shift in the air, as if she was starting to reconsider everything she had believed about the humans she had conquered. But just as quickly as the moment of connection had come, it was gone. Seraphia's expression hardened once again, and she stepped back, breaking the connection. "You will learn, human. You will learn that resistance is pointless," she said coldly. Michael didn't reply. But in that moment, something had shifted. Seraphia was starting to see him differently, not as a mere slave, but as something more dangerous. And that was the beginning of their complicated relationship. As the days passed, the Queen's commands became more personal. She asked him about his past, about his home, his people. There was no real kindness in her questions, but there was a strange interest, a curiosity that she didn't fully understand herself. And Michael, for the first time since his capture, allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for him to break free from the chains that bound him, both physically and mentally. But it wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't come without a cost. As the days turned into weeks, Michael continued his work under Queen Seraphia's strict rule. The palace had become his prison, every corner filled with reminders of his captivity. The alien queen's demands were endless, her expectations high, and every day he was tested, pushed to the limits of endurance. But despite the hardships, something inside him never faltered. His mind remained sharp, and he knew one thing for sure: he would not let her break him. It was late one evening when the first real crack in his situation appeared. Michael had just finished cleaning the grand hall, a task that took hours, and was preparing to leave when he noticed something unusual. Seraphia's personal guard, a group of ruthless alien soldiers, were gathered in the corner, whispering among themselves. They spoke in hushed tones, their voices barely audible over the hum of the palace's systems. But it wasn't the low voices that caught Michael's attention. It was the unease in their posture, the way they fidgeted and glanced around nervously. Something was wrong. He made a point of walking past them, pretending not to notice, but his mind was already racing. The guards were usually confident and stoic, their armor gleaming with a menacing shine. But today, they looked different. They were on edge. Michael's instincts as a soldier kicked in. Something big was coming. A few moments later, the palace alarm blared, sending a pulse of red light across the walls. Michael's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the sound. This wasn't a normal drill. This was an invasion. The palace was under siege. Michael and Queen Seraphia moved through the halls, avoiding the chaos outside as best they could. The walls shook with every explosion, and the sound of gunfire echoed in every corner. The rebellion, A group of rebels seeking to overthrow the queen's rule had finally reached the heart of her empire. The very palace that once symbolized power and invincibility was now a battleground. But for Michael, it wasn't just about the palace. It was about survival. It was about making sure the queen stayed alive, no matter how much he hated being in her service. As they navigated the dimly lit corridors, Michael could feel the tension in the air. Every step they took brought them closer to danger. The palace was vast, and while it had been designed to withstand attacks, it was clear that this was unlike anything it had ever faced. The rebels had breached the outer defenses, and now they were inside, fighting their way through the palace's defenses. Michael kept a hand on the queen's shoulder, guiding her as they moved through the complex. He could see the worry in her eyes, a fear that was foreign to her. Seraphia had always been a ruler, a force to be reckoned with, but now she was just another target, running for her life, unsure of what would come next. "How did this happen?" she asked, her voice a mixture of anger and disbelief. She was still trying to process everything. She had never believed that anyone could ever threaten her reign. Michael didn't answer immediately. He knew the truth, but now wasn't the time to explain. They needed to keep moving, find a safe place. He could tell the rebellion wasn't just about the palace. It was about something much deeper. The rebels were not just fighting to take power. They were fighting for freedom. And in their eyes, the queen had become a symbol of everything that was wrong with the galaxy. They reached a large fortified room near the back of the palace, a place Michael had seen only a few times. It was a hidden command center, a place where the queen could monitor the state of the empire and plan her military strategies. It was supposed to be a secure location, but now it felt like nothing more than another trap. Inside, the lights flickered as the power grid strained against the pressure of the ongoing attack. Seraphia moved to the console, her fingers flying across the holographic screens. She was still a queen, still a leader, and despite the chaos around her, her focus was unwavering. "We need to counterattack," she said, her voice steady but low. Michael watched as her eyes scanned the data coming in. He knew she was planning something dangerous, but he wasn't sure it was the right move. The rebellion had breached the palace. They were strong, organized. Seraphia was outnumbered. He took a step closer, his voice quiet. "Your Majesty, we need to retreat. This isn't the time for a counterattack. We're too exposed." Seraphia looked up at him, her eyes narrowing. She didn't like being told what to do, especially by someone she had once considered a mere servant. But in that moment, Michael saw something shift in her. There was a flicker of uncertainty in her gaze, a realization that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as invincible as she had once thought. "No," she said, her voice firm. "I will not run. Not from them. Not from anyone." Michael could see the fire in her eyes. She wasn't afraid of dying, but she was afraid of losing. She had built her empire through fear and control, and the idea of letting it all fall apart terrified her. "But they will kill you," Michael protested, frustration creeping into his voice. "You can't fight all of them. It's too dangerous." Seraphia turned away from him, her jaw clenched. "I don't need your protection. Soldier, I've ruled for centuries. I know what it means to fight for what I want." Michael felt a surge of anger. She was right. In a way, she had ruled for so long, but it had been with power, not respect. And now, that power was slipping away. The rebels weren't just fighting to kill her, they were fighting for freedom from her reign. He could feel the walls closing in around them. The rebellion was sweeping through the palace, and their resources were running thin. The palace's defenses had been compromised, and the security systems that once kept intruders at bay were now barely functional. The rebels were advancing, and Michael knew it wouldn't be long before they found their way to this room. "You're making a mistake," Michael said, his voice hard. "You can't fight them all. You don't have the strength, not without your guards." Seraphia turned to face him, her eyes cold and determined. "I've faced worse than this," she said. "I've fought battles, taken lives. I won't cower in fear now." The palace was under siege. Michael and Queen Seraphia moved through the halls, avoiding the chaos outside as best they could. The walls shook with every explosion, and the sound of gunfire echoed in every corner. The rebellion, a group of rebels seeking to overthrow the Queen's rule, had finally reached the heart of her empire. The very palace that once symbolized power and invincibility was now a battleground. But for Michael, it wasn't just about the palace. It was about survival. It was about making sure the Queen stayed alive, no matter how much he hated being in her service. As they navigated the dimly lit corridors, Michael could feel the tension in the air. Every step they took brought them closer to danger. The palace was vast, and while it had been designed to withstand attacks, it was clear that this was unlike anything it had ever faced. The rebels had breached the outer defenses, and now they were inside, fighting their way through the palace's defenses. Michael kept a hand on the Queen's shoulder, guiding her as they moved through the complex. He could see the worry in her eyes, a fear that was foreign to her. Seraphia had always been a ruler, a force to be reckoned with. But now she was just another target, running for her life, unsure of what would come next. "How did this happen?" she asked, her voice a mixture of anger and disbelief. She was still trying to process everything. She had never believed that anyone could ever threaten her reign. Michael didn't answer immediately. He knew the truth, but now wasn't the time to explain. They needed to keep moving, find a safe place. He could tell the rebellion wasn't just about the palace. It was about something much deeper. The rebels were not just fighting to take power. They were fighting for freedom. And in their eyes, the Queen had become a symbol of everything that was wrong with the galaxy. They reached a large fortified room near the back of the palace, a place Michael had seen only a few times. It was a hidden command center, a place where the Queen could monitor the state of the empire and plan her military strategies. It was supposed to be a secure location, but now it felt like nothing more than another trap. Inside, the lights flickered as the power grid strained against the pressure of the ongoing attack. Seraphia moved to the console, her fingers flying across the holographic screens. She was still a queen, still a leader, and despite the chaos around her, her focus was unwavering. "We need to counterattack," she said, her voice steady but low. Michael watched as her eyes scanned the data coming in. He knew she was planning something dangerous. But he wasn't sure it was the right move. The rebellion had breached the palace. They were strong, organized. Seraphia was outnumbered. He took a step closer, his voice quiet. "Your Majesty, we need to retreat. This isn't the time for a counterattack. We're too exposed." Seraphia looked up at him, her eyes narrowing. She didn't like being told what to do, especially by someone she had once considered a mere servant. But in that moment, Michael saw something shift in her. There was a flicker of uncertainty in her gaze, a realization that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as invincible as she had once thought. "No," she said, her voice firm. "I will not run. Not from them. Not from anyone." Michael could see the fire in her eyes. She wasn't afraid of dying, but she was afraid of losing. She had built her empire through fear and control, and the idea of letting it all fall apart terrified her. "But they will kill you," Michael protested, frustration creeping into his voice. "You can't fight all of them. It's too dangerous." Seraphia turned away from him, her jaw clenched. "I don't need your protection, soldier. I've ruled for centuries. I know what it means to fight for what I want." Michael felt a surge of anger. She was right. In a way, she had ruled for so long, but it had been with power, not respect. And now, that power was slipping away. The rebels weren't just fighting to kill her, they were fighting for freedom from her reign. He could feel the walls closing in around them. The rebellion was sweeping through the palace, and their resources were running thin. The palace's defenses had been compromised, and the security systems that once kept intruders at bay were now barely functional. The rebels were advancing, and Michael knew it wouldn't be long before they found their way to this room. "You're making a mistake," Michael said, his voice hard. "You can't fight them all. You don't have the strength, not without your guards. Seraphia turned to face him, her eyes cold and determined. I've faced worse than this, she said. I've fought battles, taken lives. I won't cower in fear now. Michael clenched his fists, but deep down, he understood. Seraphia wasn't just a queen who didn't know how to lose. She was a ruler who would rather die than surrender. And in some twisted way, Michael admired that about her. But at the same time, he knew it was a weakness, a flaw that could cost them everything. The door to the command center suddenly exploded open, and rebels poured in, weapons drawn. Michael barely had time to react before the first shot was fired. It was a blur of movement, the sound of blaster fire filling the air. Michael dove for cover, pulling Seraphia with him. Get down, he shouted, his voice sharp. The queen didn't hesitate. She hit the ground, her eyes scanning the room for any chance of escape. Michael rose to his feet, his pulse racing. The rebels were closing in, their faces hidden behind armored masks, their movements calculated. They were well-trained, organized. But Michael was a soldier too. He had fought in wars, seen the worst of humanity. And now he was about to face the worst of these rebels. He charged forward, using the element of surprise to take down one of the rebels. He fought with every ounce of strength he had, moving faster than the rebels could react. But even as he fought, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Seraphia wasn't just a queen. She was the target. The rebellion wasn't about just taking down her palace. It was about taking down everything she had built. And now, Michael realized, he was fighting not just for survival, but for the future of the galaxy. In the midst of battle, Michael knew this was just the beginning of something far bigger. The rebellion had just started, and the Queen's empire was crumbling. There was no going back. The battle was raging around them. Blaster fire echoed through the halls as the rebels pushed further into the heart of the palace. Michael's body ached from the constant movement, his mind focused on one thing: keeping Seraphia alive. Every moment felt like an eternity, the sound of gunfire and explosions growing louder with each passing second. But in the chaos, something changed. They had been trapped in the command center for hours, the rebels relentless in their pursuit. Michael had done everything he could to keep them at bay, but the odds were against them. He could hear the rebels' voices outside the door, and he knew it was only a matter of time before they breached the last line of defense. The Queen was becoming more and more frustrated, pacing back and forth as she tried to think of a way out. But Michael could see the panic in her eyes, the fear that was creeping in despite her attempts to hide it. "We need to act now," Michael said, his voice sharp and urgent. "If we don't make a move soon, we won't get another chance." Seraphia's eyes flicked toward him. She was silent for a moment, as if considering his words. The anger in her expression softened, but only for an instant. She was a queen, and she didn't like being told what to do. But deep down, she knew Michael was right. They were running out of options. "How do we get out of here?" she asked, her voice quiet, almost resigned. Michael's mind raced as he thought about their options. The command center had only one exit, and that was now heavily guarded by the rebels. But there was another way out, an old, unused maintenance tunnel that ran beneath the palace. It wasn't well known, even to the Queen's soldiers. It was a risky move, but it was their only hope. "There's a tunnel," Michael said, his voice low. "It's not far from here. We can use it to slip past the rebels and get to the lower levels of the palace. From there, we can find a way to escape." Seraphia's gaze hardened. "And what if the rebels are already there?" she asked, skeptical. "We'll have to move quickly, but it's the only way." For a moment, Seraphia hesitated. She had built her empire on power, on fear, and she had never been the one to run from a fight. But as the explosions rattled the walls around them and the rebels closed in, she knew Michael was right. She didn't have a choice. If she wanted to survive, if she wanted to keep her empire, they had to escape now. "Let's go," she said, her voice steady, but filled with urgency. They moved quickly, Michael leading the way. The tunnel was hidden behind a series of metal panels in the corner of the command center. Michael worked quickly, prying open the panels and revealing the narrow passage. It was dark and cramped, but it was their only option. He motioned for Seraphia to follow and slid into the tunnel, pulling her along behind him. The tunnel was narrow, barely wide enough for them to move side by side. The walls were damp, and the air smelled musty, like it hadn't been used in years. They moved quickly, every step echoing in the silence. Michael kept his ears open for any sound of pursuit, but the tunnel seemed to be abandoned. It was a stroke of luck, and Michael couldn't afford to waste. They had been moving for what felt like an eternity when they reached a large underground chamber. The tunnel opened into a cavernous room filled with old equipment, long forgotten by the palace. This part of the palace had been abandoned years ago, and it was clear that no one had been down here in a long time. Michael took a deep breath, his senses alert. He didn't trust this place. It was too quiet, too empty. But there was no time to waste. He had to keep moving. He motioned for Seraphia to follow as they made their way across the room, searching for another exit. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the sound of footsteps. Michael froze, his heart racing. He could hear the rebels moving through the tunnels, their voices low and urgent. They were close, too close. "Hide," Michael whispered urgently, pulling Seraphia behind a large piece of machinery. They crouched in the shadows, holding their breath as the rebels passed by, unaware of their presence. Michael's pulse raced as the rebels moved past them, only a few feet away. He could hear their boots clanging against the metal floor, the sound growing fainter as they moved deeper into the tunnels. He waited for what felt like an eternity, making sure the rebels were gone before he finally relaxed his grip on Seraphia's arm. "We have to move," Michael said, his voice a low whisper. Seraphia nodded, her eyes wide. "How much further?" "Not much. Just keep moving." They moved deeper into the palace's underground network, avoiding the rebels as best they could. Michael's mind was racing, trying to think of a plan. The tunnels were their best chance, but they were still far from safety. The rebels could be anywhere, and the longer they stayed down here, the more likely they were to be discovered. But as they neared the end of the tunnel, Michael saw a flicker of light ahead. It was the exit, a small hatch leading to the lower levels of the palace. They were almost there. Michael's heart pounded in his chest as they reached the hatch. He looked around quickly, making sure there were no rebels nearby. The hatch was old, but it still worked. He could feel the relief washing over him as he pushed it open, revealing the darkened hallway beyond. They stepped out into the corridor, their footsteps echoing in the silence. They had made it. They were out of the tunnels, and now they had to find a way to escape the palace entirely. But as they turned to move deeper into the palace, Michael felt a strange sense of dread. The tide was turning, but there was still a long way to go, and the rebellion was far from over. Seraphia looked at him, her eyes filled with determination. "We're not finished yet. We still have a chance to win this." Michael nodded, his grip tightening on his weapon. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, it felt like they had a real chance. The tide was turning, and maybe, just maybe, they could survive this. The battle was over. The palace that had once been a symbol of Seraphia's power was now a crumbling ruin. The sounds of gunfire and explosions had faded, leaving behind an eerie silence. Michael stood at the edge of the courtyard, his breath heavy, his body bruised and bloodied from the fight. His eyes scanned the battlefield, taking in the wreckage and the fallen soldiers. The rebels had won, but it had come at a great cost. The rebels, once just a band of rebels fighting for freedom, were now the new rulers of the planet. But Michael didn't feel victorious. He had seen too much death, too much destruction. He had lost friends, soldiers, and allies. And yet, amid the ruins, there was something that made him believe in the possibility of a new beginning. Seraphia stood beside him, her expression solemn. Her once proud form was now a shadow of its former glory. The queen who had once ruled with an iron fist, now humbled by the rebellion's triumph. Her eyes had changed over the course of the battle, softening, and there was a sense of regret in them now. She had never wanted this destruction, this loss. But it was too late to undo what had been done. The rebellion had taken its toll, and now they had to rebuild. Michael turned to her, his gaze steady. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. Seraphia didn't answer immediately. She looked around at the battlefield, her eyes lingering on the fallen soldiers. The rebels had won, but they had lost much in the process. The war had cost them everything they had fought for. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice low. "I never thought I'd see the day when I was on the losing side. But now I see things differently. The way I ruled, harshly, with fear, it wasn't the right way. It only led to this." Her voice cracked slightly, the weight of her words heavy in the air. Michael could see the regret in her eyes, and for the first time, he saw the queen who had once been feared by all, now struggling with the consequences of her actions. "There's always a way forward," Michael said, his voice firm. "You don't have to do this alone." Seraphia looked at him, her expression uncertain. "But what if it's too late? What if everything we've done can't be undone?" Michael took a step closer to her. "We can rebuild. Together." For a moment, Seraphia didn't respond. She just stood there, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to find some glimmer of hope. Slowly, she nodded. "I never thought I'd be here," she whispered. "I never thought I'd have to rely on someone like you. But maybe you're right. Maybe it's not too late." Michael extended his hand to her, his gesture offering not just support, but a chance at redemption. Seraphia hesitated, then took his hand in hers. It was a small gesture, but it was enough. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe that there was hope for the future. As they stood together, a new resolve began to take root within them both. The rebellion had brought them to this point, but it was not the end. It was a new beginning, one where they could work together to rebuild what had been lost. Michael had seen the worst of Seraphia's reign, but now he was seeing a different side of her, a side that was vulnerable, unsure, and yet willing to change. Seraphia turned toward the rebels, who were beginning to regroup and assess the damage. The once feared queen now stood beside the very people who had sought to overthrow her. It was a strange sight, but it was one that spoke of a future where alliances could be forged, even from the ashes of war. "There's a lot of work ahead of us," Seraphia said, her voice steady once again. "But I won't rule like I did before. I'll listen to them. I'll lead with wisdom, not fear." Michael nodded. He had seen the change in her, and he believed in her words. She wasn't the queen who had once commanded fear and obedience, but a leader who was willing to learn, to grow, and to put her people's needs first. It wasn't going to be easy, but Michael knew that if anyone could make it work, it was her. And if she couldn't, he would be there to help her, just as he had been from the very beginning. Together, they walked back toward the center of the courtyard, where the rebels had begun to gather. Michael could see the wariness in their eyes, the uncertainty about what the future would hold. They had fought for freedom, but what kind of freedom would they have now? What kind of leaders would they become? But Michael knew that the future wasn't written yet. It was up to them to decide. And together, they could make sure that it was a future built on cooperation, understanding, and hope. Seraphia stopped in front of the crowd, her voice commanding their attention. "The war is over," she said, her words clear and firm. "But the real work begins now. We've lost much, but we gained something more important, our future. Together, we will rebuild this planet. Together, we will make sure that we never repeat the mistakes of the past." The crowd was silent for a moment. But then, slowly, the murmurs began. The rebels were listening. They were no longer just fighting for survival. They were fighting for something greater. And Seraphia, once the queen of fear and destruction, was now the leader of a new era. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to happen overnight. But as Michael stood beside Seraphia, watching her speak to the rebels, he couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. They had survived the war. And now, together, they would build something new. The battle had been long and hard, but it had forged something even stronger, a bond between them, between Michael and Seraphia, and between the rebels and the Queen. They had all fought for a future, and now they would make that future a reality. It wasn't the end. It was just the beginning.